I knew then that Kenny, and obviously I knew him from my playing days with him. I thought he was an ideal captain, and in the very first year I was at Arsenal as manager, captained us at Wembley, and they won the trophies. It was probably I think it was the only trophy that Kenny won, and it was nice to see him, me being a colleague as a player.
I'd love to see him. I don't see him every day. I see the miserable git, and I try and make people laugh, and I think I'm being funny, and I'm trying to make myself feel good and make people feel I'm a nice person. But this addiction is just, my gambling one is just, it's massive. It's just, I just can't answer that question. I really don't know.
I am Oliver, and this is Sport Icons. There are footballers who fade. They retire, do some punditry, maybe open a pub, and life carries on. And then there's Kenny Sansom, 86 caps for England, one of the most decorated left-backs this country has ever produced. A man who played alongside the best, who had the career that boys dream about in their back gardens. And by 2013, he was sleeping in a park with a carrier bag. Not a metaphor. Not an exaggeration. A park bench, in the cold, with everything he'd once had reduced to what fit in a plastic bag. The question isn't whether Kenny Sansom was a great footballer. Everyone already knows he was. The question is how a man gets from there to here. Kenny Sansom was born in 1958 in Camberwell, South London. The area wasn't soft, and his upbringing wasn't easy, but on the surface, his early years didn't carry the same obvious fractures you'd find in other stories like this. What he had from very young was football, a natural left foot that caught the eye of Crystal Palace when he was still a teenager, and the reading of the game that made coaches take notice immediately. By the time he was 17, he was a professional. By 20, he was one of the most promising fullbacks in the country. The trajectory looked clean. There was nothing in the early chapter of his life to suggest what was coming. That's actually what makes this harder to understand than most fall stories. There was no obvious crack in the foundation, no defining trauma that you can point at and say, that's where it started. What there was, quietly and without much fanfare, was a culture. The drinking culture that ran through professional football in the late 1970s and 1980s was not a secret. It was embedded. Socializing meant drinking. Celebrating meant drinking. Coping with a bad result meant drinking. For most players, it stayed manageable, something they grew out of when the career ended and the routine changed. For Sansom, it didn't stay manageable. It grew alongside him. At Crystal Palace and then at Arsenal, he was building the kind of career that earns a man a statue. But even during those years, the drinking was present. Not loud, not causing scenes, not getting him arrested, just there. Running alongside the success in a way that nobody around him had reason to treat as a warning. He was performing at the highest level. He was a regular England starter. From the outside, there was nothing to see. That's the cruelest part of how addiction works in a high-functioning person. The performance masks the problem long enough that by the time the performance stops, the problem has had years to embed itself properly. And when football eventually ended for Kenny Sansom, what waited on the other side wasn't a manageable habit. It was something that had been quietly getting stronger for a very long time. Arsenal paid Crystal Palace £1 million for Kenny Sansom in 1980, and within a season, it was already obvious they'd underpaid. He settled into the left-back position at Heighway as if the shirt had been made specifically for him. Composed in the tackle, relentless up the flank, difficult to beat one-on-one, even when opponents knew exactly what he was going to do. The technical quality was real, but what separated Sansom from other fullbacks of that era was the consistency. Week after week, home and away, big match and routine league fixture, he performed at a level that most defenders only hit occasionally. Terry Neal signed him, but it was Don Howe and then George Graham who benefited from having him at his peak. At Highbury, where the standard was always serious, Sansom was a cornerstone. Not the loudest voice in the dressing room, not the player whose name got sung the loudest, but the kind of professional a club builds around because you know exactly what you're getting every single time he crosses the white line. The England career ran parallel to all of it. Ron Greenwood called him up, and Bobby Robson kept faith with him, and by the time the 1986 World Cup in Mexico came around, Sansom had accumulated a level of international experience that almost no English defender before him could match. 86 caps in total. For a left-back in an era when England had genuine depth in every position, that number tells you everything. He wasn't rotating in and out of the squad. He was the answer to the question of who plays left-back for England, and the answer barely changed for the best part of a decade. The 1986 squad in particular carried enormous expectation. England had talent throughout the team, Sansom anchoring the defensive shape, while players like Lineker and Hoddle provided the attacking threat. They reached the quarter-finals before going out to Diego Maradona's Argentina in the match everyone remembers for 2 goals that sit at opposite ends of human achievement. Sansom was there for both of them. He'd played his part in getting England that far, and the footage from those games shows a defender still operating at the top of his ability, fully professional, nothing outwardly broken. From the outside, the picture was straightforward: a working-class boy from South London who'd made it as far as the game allowed. Decorated, respected, financially comfortable in a way most people from his background never got to be. The career had given him everything it was capable of giving. What the career had also done, without anyone registering it clearly enough, was provide the one structure keeping everything else in order. The training schedule, the matchday routine, the team environment, all of it created a framework around a habit that was already deeper than anyone around him understood. Football wasn't just Sansom's profession, it was, without him knowing it, the thing holding the rest of his life together. And professional football, for every player, regardless of what they've achieved, eventually ends. For most men, that's a transition. For Kenny Sansom, it was the beginning of something else entirely. When the football stopped, the structure went with it. That sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but the reality of what that meant for Kenny Sansom took years to fully surface. The drinking that had run quietly alongside his career didn't suddenly announce itself on the day he retired. It expanded slowly, filling the space that training sessions and match preparation had previously occupied, growing into something far heavier than the social habit most people around him had assumed it was. The gambling arrived alongside it, 2 addictions feeding each other in the way they always do, one numbing the anxiety that the other created, each one justifying the next hit because the losses needed covering, and the losses always needed covering. People who knew Sansom during the years after his playing days described a man who was still likeable, still the Kenny they recognized, but who was losing ground in ways that were becoming harder to look past. The money started going, not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment you could point at as the turning point, but steadily and then quickly, the way financial ruin always moves. At his peak, Sansom had earned serious money. A top Arsenal player through the 1980s, 86 international appearances, the kind of career that should have left a man set for life. The house, the cars, the lifestyle that came with being a recognizable face from a successful era of English football. It was all real, and it all went. The combination of alcohol and gambling is extraordinarily efficient at dismantling financial security, because neither habit has a natural stopping point, and both become more expensive as they deepen. By the time people outside his immediate circle started noticing that something was seriously wrong, the money was largely gone. His marriage broke down, his family relationships frayed under the weight of behavior that no amount of past affection can indefinitely absorb. The man who'd been a cornerstone of one of English football's most celebrated eras was living a life that bore almost no resemblance to what came before it. 7 bottles of wine a day. That's the figure that appeared in his own accounts of the worst period. Not 7 glasses, 7 bottles. A volume of alcohol that stops being a habit and becomes something the body depends on to function. A quantity that does measurable, lasting damage to organs and brain tissue over time. He wasn't hiding it by that point. He was past the stage of hiding anything. By 2013, photos emerged that stopped people. Kenny Sansom, sleeping in a park, a carrier bag beside him. An England international with 86 caps to his name, sitting on a bench with nowhere to go. He gave interviews during that period that were painful to read. He admitted to being depressed, admitted to feeling like he'd be better off not being here. There was no performance in what he said. It was a man at the absolute floor of what life had left him, speaking plainly about where he'd ended up. 3 years later, in 2016, it happened again. More photographs, Another park, the same terrible image of a man who had once played at a World Cup, reduced to sleeping rough. The football community reacted with shock each time, but shock without any real mechanism to fix the underlying problem doesn't change much. The Professional Footballers Association provided support, people reached out, and still, for a significant stretch of his post-football life, Kenny Sansom was a man without a home and without the physical or mental health to build one back. The distance between Wembley and a park bench isn't something most people can picture. For Sansom, it was the distance between 1986 and 2013, 27 years. A career, a marriage, a fortune, and a man's health, all of it gone. By 2020, the years of sustained alcohol abuse had already done the kind of internal damage that doesn't announce itself cleanly until something sudden forces the issue. Kenny Sansom was 61 years old, in poor health, and already vulnerable in the most literal sense of the word when he was assaulted in May of that year. The details of the attack are sparse, but the consequences were not. He was hospitalized in what people close to him described as a vulnerable state. The injuries were severe enough that he spent 18 days in a coma. 18 days. Not hours. Not a short unconscious spell from which he woke up groggy and sore. 18 days in which the outcome was genuinely uncertain, and the people who cared about him were sitting with the real possibility that he wouldn't come back from it. He did come back, but what he came back to wasn't straightforward. Basic functions had to be relearned. Walking, talking, the kind of physical and cognitive recovery that most people only encounter in the context of serious neurological trauma, and that required a level of sustained medical support that nobody gets through quickly or easily. The man who came out of that hospital was not the man who went in, and the man who went in had already been through years of deterioration. The assault accelerated something that the alcohol had been working on for a long time, because around the same time, another detail emerged. Kenny Sansom had been diagnosed with Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. If you haven't heard that name, it's a brain disorder caused by a severe deficiency in thiamine, vitamin B1, and it's closely associated with chronic, heavy alcohol abuse. The name most people use for it is wet brain. It affects memory, coordination, cognitive function, and in serious cases, it causes a form of dementia that doesn't reverse. The brain damage is the direct result of what alcohol does to the body's ability to absorb and retain the nutrients it needs to function. It isn't something that develops overnight. It's the accumulation of years of the body running on empty, the nervous system slowly losing what it needs to hold itself together. For someone who had spent the better part of 2 decades drinking at the volumes Sansom had described in his own interviews, the diagnosis wasn't shocking to anyone who understood the condition. But that doesn't make it less devastating to sit with. This was a man whose football intelligence, whose ability to read a game and position himself and make split-second decisions under pressure had been one of the defining features of his career. 86 caps doesn't happen by accident. It happens because a player's mind works at a level that most people never reach. And the thing that had been eating away at that mind for years had now been given a name. What the assault and the diagnosis together represent is the point where the story of Kenny Sansom stops being about choices and becomes something harder to categorize. Addiction is complicated enough when you're discussing a man who could still, in theory, have turned it around on any given day. Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome is a different conversation. The body and the brain had taken damage that no amount of willpower could fully undo. The floor he'd hit in 2013 and again in 2016 turned out not to have been the floor at all. There was further to fall, and in 2020 he found it. What happened after 2020 is quieter, and in a story this heavy, quiet is worth something. Sansom survived the coma. He survived the diagnosis. He went through rehabilitation that most people in his position never complete, and the reports coming out of the last year describe a man who has, by all accounts, managed to stay away from alcohol. He's rebuilding relationships with his children and his grandchildren. He remains under medical supervision, and the PFA, the same organisation that had supported him through the worst of the homeless years, continues to be part of his life. It isn't a clean ending. Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome doesn't offer clean endings, but it's a life being lived, carefully, one day at a time, and after everything the previous decade threw at him, that is not a small thing. The legacy he leaves in football is easier to summarise than the legacy he carries personally. 86 caps, a First Division title with Arsenal, a career that earned him genuine respect from teammates and opponents who understood what it took to perform at that level consistently over that many years. Ask anyone who played alongside him in the 1980s, and the word that comes back almost every time is reliable. Not flashy, not the one whose name gets sung first when people reminisce about that era, but the one the entire defensive structure depended on to be right, and who almost always was. That reliability makes the post-football years harder to reconcile, not easier. It would be simpler, in a strange way, if Sansom had been troubled all along, if there'd been warning signs during his playing days that nobody acted on. There weren't, or at least none that were visible from the outside. He performed, he turned up, he did his job at the highest level, repeatedly, for years, and then the scaffolding came down and there was nothing underneath it. That's the part of his story that goes beyond Kenny Sansom specifically. His generation of professional footballers retired into a world that had no real framework for what they were going through. No mandatory counselling, no transition support, no structured help for men who'd spent their entire adult lives inside the rhythm of professional sport and suddenly found themselves outside it with a lump sum, no daily purpose, and habits that had never needed managing before because the game had managed them. The PFA has evolved since then. The conversation around mental health in sport is different now, but for the men who retired in the late 1980s and 1990s, that evolution came too late to do much good. Kenny Sansom walked out of professional football as one of the most capped defenders England had ever produced. What waited for him on the other side of that door? And how long it took anyone with real institutional power to understand what was happening is a question the sport still hasn't fully answered. He went from Wembley to a park bench and back again, and most people only noticed the middle part. Kenny Sansom's story isn't just about addiction or bad decisions. It's about what happens when a sport takes everything from a man and hands him nothing to replace it with. Send your prayers for Kenny in the comments below. And if this story stayed with you, hit the like button and subscribe for more.
£1 million player arrived at Nottingham Forest this morning in his white Jaguar, and Mrs. Trevor Francis was there too. They were met by assistant manager Peter Taylor, and discussions began at once. Manager Brian Clough arrived sometime later, his regular game of squash, the preliminary to the day's talks.
July 24th, 2023, Marbella, Spain. The sun is already climbing over the Mediterranean, warm and indifferent, the way it always is on the Costa del Sol. Inside a quiet apartment a few streets back from the water, Trevor Francis, Britain's first £1 million footballer, a European Cup winner, a man who had survived a heart attack and buried his wife and kept going anyway, died alone. His family called it a huge shock. He had just passed his annual health checks. He had been walking every day. He had been doing everything right, and still, quietly, without warning, the heart gave out. The end of Trevor Francis wasn't loud, it wasn't scandalous, it was just a man, a room, and a morning that never finished. Trevor Francis grew up in Plymouth, the kind of place that produces tough, grounded people. Football was his way out, and he moved fast. By 16, he was already playing First Division football for Birmingham City, a teenager doing things that grown men couldn't. Defenders twice his age couldn't live with him. The scouts noticed, the clubs noticed, and by 1979, Brian Clough came calling. Nottingham Forest paid £1 million for Francis that year. No British club had ever spent that much on a single player. The number was staggering, the kind of fee that follows a man around, that becomes part of who he is, whether he likes it or not. Clough, being Clough, had no interest in letting it go to Francis's head, so he made the £1 million man make tea for the staff. He sent him to play on muddy park pitches for the A-team. He made it very clear that the price tag meant nothing inside that dressing room. Francis took it. He didn't sulk, didn't push back, didn't let the ego that £1 million valuation could reasonably have built do any damage. And then, in his very first game in European competition, he scored the winning goal in the 1979 European Cup final against Malmo. One game, one goal, the biggest prize in club football. Quiet, dignified, and completely devastating. That was Trevor Francis. Behind all of it, there was Helen. They met when they were both teenagers, and they married young. Over the next 43 years, she was at every club, every city, every chapter. When Francis moved, Helen moved. When he managed, she was there. People who knew them used the same word every time, inseparable. Not in the way people say it loosely, but in the way that means two people have genuinely become one unit, and neither of them could quite function as a standalone version of themselves. In 2017, Helen died after a long battle with breast cancer. Francis was 63 years old, and he had never really spent a day of his adult life without her. 2 years later, he published his autobiography. He called it 1 in a Million. The title wasn't about the transfer fee. He wrote plainly, without drama, that life without her was so difficult. No performance, no self-pity, just a man stating the truth of it. The woman who had made everything make sense was gone. The silence she left behind was a different kind of weight entirely. Friends noticed the retreat. The public smile held. Francis kept appearing, kept being gracious, kept being the gentleman everyone remembered. But the foundation underneath had shifted. He was moving through the days differently now, carefully, like a man navigating a house where all the furniture had been rearranged in the dark. The grief wasn't loud, and that was almost the hardest part. It just sat there, steady and heavy, going nowhere. 5 years before Helen died, the body had already sent its first warning. In 2012, Francis suffered a major heart attack. Not a mild episode, not a scare that got cleaned up quickly and sent him home with a prescription. A serious, life-threatening event that took doctors 11 hours to correctly diagnose. 11 hours. By the time they finally understood what was happening inside his chest, Francis had already been through the kind of night that changes a man's relationship with his own mortality. He said afterward that he felt lucky to be alive. That wasn't a phrase he used loosely. It meant every word of it. After 2012, he became almost methodical about his health. Daily power walks, strict routines, the kind of discipline that comes not from vanity, but from a man who has genuinely stared at the edge and decided he'd rather not get that close again. He monitored himself. He showed up to his annual checks. He did the work. And for a while, the body cooperated. But the career had left its own marks, and they weren't all physical. Managerial years were complicated in ways his playing days never were. At QPR, Francis fined a player named Martin Allen for missing a match to attend the birth of his child. The backlash was immediate and unforgiving. A nation that had always seen Francis as the consummate gentleman suddenly had a different story to tell about him, and the gap between those two versions was uncomfortable for everyone, probably including Francis himself. He was a man who prided himself on doing things the right way. To be publicly cast as the villain of that particular story didn't sit easily. Then came Crystal Palace and Simon Jordan and 2003. Jordan sacked Francis on his birthday, not the day before, not the week after, his actual birthday. Jordan later joked that he could have posted the P45 in a birthday card, which said something about Jordan's character, but it also said something about how football had started treating a man who had always carried himself with quiet dignity. That was Francis's last job in management. He walked out of the dugout for the final time on the day he turned another year older. And there was no clean ending, no farewell, just the door closing behind him. None of these things broke him individually, but they accumulated the way things do, quietly adding weight to a man who was already carrying more than people could see from the outside. By the time Helen got sick, the body and the career and the private life had all been through their own versions of damage. What came after her death wasn't a single collapse. It was more like a slow settling, the way a structure shifts when the load-bearing wall finally goes. After Helen died, Francis split his time between his home in Solihull and an apartment near Marbella on the southern coast of Spain. The sun helped, or at least it was easier than English winters, spent in a house that had been built around a life that no longer existed in the same shape. For a couple of years, people close to him said he was quiet, withdrawn, finding his way through something that has no real instruction manual. Grief at that depth doesn't follow a schedule. It doesn't peak and then resolve. It just moves through a person at its own pace, and all you can really do is keep walking. And walking is exactly what Francis did. Every day, the same discipline he had brought to football, brought to management, brought to his recovery after 2012. He walked, he checked in with his doctors, he stayed active. By 2023, the people around him noticed something shifting. The health checks were coming back clean. He seemed lighter, not healed exactly, but less submerged than he had been. He was finding small pieces of life again. On the morning of July 24, 2023, Trevor Francis died of a heart attack in his Marbella apartment. He was 69 years old, the same age Helen had been when she died. His family described it as a huge shock. And here is what makes that so hard to sit with. It genuinely was. This wasn't wasn't a man who had been reckless. He hadn't ignored warning signs or skipped appointments or gone quiet on the people who cared about him. He had done everything a person is supposed to do. He passed the checks, he kept the routines, he gave his body every possible reason to keep going. Britain's first £1 million footballer, a European Cup winner, a man who had survived a previous heart attack and 6 years of grief and a career full of sharp edges, died quietly, alone, in the apartment he had retreated to after losing the person who made everything else matter. There was no stage, no crowd, no send-off that matched the size of the life, just a Marbella morning and then silence. Trevor Francis never really chase the legend. That's the thing that stays with you when you go back through the whole arc of his life. He had every reason to. The price tag alone would have justified it. Britain's first £1 million footballer. That title carries weight. It opens rooms, it gets you on panels and into speaking engagements and onto the back pages for decades after the boots come off. Francis had all of that available to him, and he mostly left it on the table. The Clough years shape that, probably more than anything else. When the most expensive player in British football history arrives at a club and the manager's response is to make him brew tea and run out for the A-team on a freezing park pitch, something either breaks or it settles. With Francis, it settled. Clough was trying to strip the mythology away before it could calcify, and Francis let him do it. He didn't fight the humbling, he absorbed it, and what came out the other side was a man who understood that the number attached to his transfer didn't say anything about his character. That was something he had to earn separately, in smaller moments, over a much longer time. And he did earn it. The players who played under him talked about someone who treated people with consistency, who didn't change his temperature depending on who was watching. The managers and coaches who crossed his path came back to the same word, the same one his family used, same one journalists reached for when they ran out of more specific things to say. Gentlemen. In a sport that has never been short of loud voices and sharp elbows, that word costs something. It doesn't get applied to men who haven't worked for it. His autobiography sits in an unusual place in the canon of football memoirs. Most of them are settlements, old scores, old grudges, the version of events that the author once lodged in the record before someone else gets there first. 1 in a million isn't that. There's no settling of scores in it, no late career bitterness dressed up as reflection. It's a book about a woman. A long, plainly written love letter from a man who is trying to work out how to exist in the world without the person he had built everything around. The transfer fee gave the title a double meaning, but Francis knew which meaning he was writing toward. Ellen was the 1 in a million. Everything else was context. That's his legacy, and it sits in a genuinely strange place if you try to measure it by the usual standards. Historic transfer fee, yes. European Cup winner, yes. Respected manager who took Birmingham City to the League Cup final and guided Sheffield Wednesday through some of their better years, yes. But talk to the people who actually knew him, and those things tend to come second. What they reach for first is the marriage, the 43 years, the way he was with her, and the way he was without her. You can ask whether that's a tragedy or the best version of a life, and there's no clean answer. A man who is defined more by love than by achievement. In a world that mostly measures men by what they won, there's something right about that. There's also something painful about watching someone spend 6 years slowly losing their footing because the person who grounded them is gone. Both of those things are true at the same time. The story doesn't resolve them, it just holds them together. What Francis left behind isn't a complicated legacy in terms of reputation. Nobody is going back through the archive looking to revise the verdict. He was good, he was decent, he won things, he managed with integrity most of the time, he loved his wife completely. That's the record. The Martin Allen fine sits in there, awkward and unresolved, a reminder that even the most consistent people have moments that don't fit the story cleanly. The Crystal Palace ending sits in there too, bitter and undignified in the way football so often is to the people who gave it the most. Those are footnotes. The main text is cleaner than most. He was a man who arrived at the top of English football as a teenager, carried the weight of an impossible price tag without crumbling under it, scored the goal that won a European Cup in his first appearance in the competition, then spent the back half of his life trying to be the same person whether anyone was watching or not. That's not nothing. In fact, for a sport that has a long history of eating its own, it's closer to everything. The football world lost him on a Tuesday morning in Spain, in the middle of summer, and most people were on holiday and the fixtures had hadn't started yet. The tributes came quickly, and they were genuine, which is not always the case. Managers who had competed against him, players who had learned from him, supporters who remembered him lighting up grounds in the late 70s and 80s. The word gentleman appeared so many times in those tributes that it stopped sounding like a compliment, started sounding like an accurate description of something specific and real. He was 69 years old. He left 2 sons. He left a life that was fuller than a lot of people understood while he was living it, quieter in its final years than anyone outside his close circle really knew. Trevor Francis passed every test the doctors gave him. He walked every day, checked every box, gave his heart every reason to keep going. The thing that took him wasn't carelessness. It was just time, moving the way it always does, without asking permission. The £1 million boy from Plymouth loved one woman for 43 years, won the biggest prize in club football, and left the world quietly in the Spanish sun. Some men burn out loudly. Francis just ran out of mourning. Send some prayers for Trevor and Helen in the comments below. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. There is a version of Trevor Francis's story that gets told as a footnote to Brian Clough's story, the superstar who got humbled, the £1 million man who made the tea. It's a good anecdote, and Clough told it well, the way Clough told everything. But that framing does Francis a quiet disservice, because it makes him the object of someone else's lesson, rather than the subject of his own life. The fuller picture is more interesting than the anecdote. Francis arrived at Nottingham Forest carrying a number that had never been attached to a British player before, and he handled it without drama. He didn't arrive with demands, or with the kind of entourage that kind of money can start to attract. He trained. He deferred to Clough where deference was required. He scored the goal when the moment arrived, and then he got on with it. There was no celebration that outstayed its welcome, no extended mythology built around the night in Munich. He scored the goal, the cup came home, and Francis moved on to the next thing. That pattern repeated itself across the whole career. Arrival, contribution, quiet exit. Birmingham City, Nottingham Forest, Manchester City, Sampdoria, Rangers, Sheffield Wednesday. Player, then manager, then private man trying to hold himself together after the worst loss of his life. No stage was ever quite big enough to make him someone he wasn't. Not the £1 million fee, not the European Cup, not the public humiliation of the birthday sacking, not the grief that followed Helen's death. He remained, through all of it, recognisably himself. That's rarer than it sounds. Football has a way of reshaping people, of pressing them into whatever the moment needs them to be. The superstar, the villain, the fallen hero, the cautionary tale. Francis resisted most of those shapes. He stayed quiet and grounded and consistent, even when consistency cost him something. Even when the quiet meant people underestimated what he was carrying. By the end, what he was carrying was considerable. A heart that had already broken once, medically speaking, in 2012. A career that had ended not with a farewell, with a P45 slipped under the door. 6-year absence where the person who made the house feel like home was no longer in it. And still he walked. Still he showed up. Still he passed the checks and made the calls and kept moving forward because that was who he was and because on some level there was nothing else to do. The Marbella apartment wasn't a retreat from life, it was where he went to keep living it on his own terms, in the sun, at whatever pace the days would allow. That he died there on a quiet Tuesday morning, having done everything right, is the part of the story that doesn't resolve cleanly. There is no lesson in it, no moral to extract, just a good man at the end of a full life, gone before anyone was ready.
Non-Liverpool game, a goal. We have this view of Liverpool as this pass the ball around and create a chance. This was a long punt out from Ray Clements, a flick on from John Toshak, and I'd run off the wing diagonally and put it in with the next touch.
Steve Heighway was a force of nature on that left wing. Fast, direct, impossible to contain. He wore the red of Liverpool like it was made for him, and for most of the 1970s, he was one of the most exciting players in England. But what if I told you that behind all that brilliance, behind every trophy and every standing ovation, Steve Heighway was always fighting a battle most people never saw. And now, at 78, the man who helped build Liverpool's dynasty is living a life that would break your heart if you knew the full story. His daughter has started to speak. What she's revealed tells us something painful about what football really does to the men who give it everything. We're going to go through the chapters of his life, from the glory to the grief, because there's far more to this story than the highlight reels ever showed. And stay with us, because the part about what happened at Liverpool's academy and why he walked away is the part nobody ever talks about. Let's go back to the beginning, because this is where you start to understand the weight Heighway carried his entire career. It was 1970. Liverpool signed a winger from Skelmersdale United who had a degree in economics and politics from the University of Warwick. Think about that for a second. It wasn't just unusual in football. The hard, unforgiving world of 1970s English football, it made him a target from day one. His teammates called him Big Bamba after Bamba Gascoigne, the host of University Challenge. It sounds harmless enough, like a bit of dressing room banter, but in that era, in that culture, carried a sharper edge. The message underneath it was simple: you don't really belong here. Football in the 1970s was built on toughness, on sweat and grit, and a certain kind of working-class identity had no room for a man who'd spent years in lecture halls studying political theory. The unspoken question hanging over Heighway every single day is whether a man like him could survive in a world like this. And here's the thing, he answered that question every time he stepped on the pitch. He was direct, brave, relentless. He didn't shy away from the physical side of the game, ran at defenders who wanted to hurt him, and he kept running. But no matter how many times he proved himself between the white lines, that outsider label followed him. It followed him through his playing days, through his coaching career, and in some ways, it never fully left. Daughter has spoken about how that early sense of not quite belonging shaped everything that came after. Need to prove himself, refusal to compromise. The way he took personal pride in his work to a degree that could become its own kind of burden. That's where this story really starts. Not on the pitch at Anfield, but in a dressing room where a young man with a university degree was being told, quietly and constantly, that he wasn't quite one of them. By the late 1970s, Heighway was at the peak of his powers. 2 European Cups, league titles, an FA Cup, as part of one of the greatest club sides English football had ever produced. And his contribution to that team was real and lasting. But football doesn't wait for anyone, and between 1980 and 1982, Heighway watched his first team opportunities at Liverpool dry up faster than he could have imagined. The squad was evolving. New players were coming in. The manager was rotating differently. And Heighway, who had given a decade of his life to that club, found himself on the outside looking in during some of the biggest moments. Missed out on medal opportunities during that period. Matches he should have been part of. Trophies that were won without him playing the role he'd earned. For a man who had dedicated himself so completely to Liverpool Football Club, that kind of slow fade is its own form of grief. It's not a dramatic betrayal. Nobody stabbed him in the back. There's something quietly devastating about being made to feel unnecessary at the place you've given everything to. And that feeling, his daughter has suggested, never fully went away. By 1981, the decision was made. Heighway left Liverpool and crossed the Atlantic to join the Minnesota Kicks in the North American Soccer League. The Minnesota chapter of Steve Heighway's life is one most football fans don't know about. And it's one of the more painful stretches of his story. Arrived in the United States with the intention of extending his playing career in a league that was genuinely trying to grow the game. The NASL had ambition. It had crowds. It had a sense of possibility. And for a player of Heighway's quality, it seemed like a reasonable next step. The Minnesota Kicks were in serious trouble. The club was riddled with financial problems that went far deeper than anyone on the outside could see. The money was unreliable, the structure was unstable, and eventually the franchise folded entirely, leaving Heighway without a club, without a clear future, and far from home. Think about what that moment looks like for a man who'd spent his entire professional life inside one of the most well-run football clubs in the world. Liverpool under Shankly and Paisley was a machine, organised, stable, purposeful. Minnesota was the opposite of everything he'd known. He described that period as unhappy. That's the word he used. Not devastating, not catastrophic, just unhappy. And somehow, that understatement makes it feel worse. He eventually found his way into coaching and consultancy work with Umbro, rebuilding piece by piece. But the American dream had turned into something much harder, and it left a mark on him that took years to process. Make sure to like and subscribe. And now, back to the video. Here's where where the story takes a turn that most people completely miss. After his playing days, Heighway came back to Liverpool, not as a player, but as the man responsible for building the next generation. He became the head of Liverpool's academy, and what he built there was, by any measure, extraordinary. Michael Owen, Robbie Fowler, Steven Gerrard, Jamie Carragher. These weren't just good players. These were generational talents, and Steve Heighway had a hand in shaping every single one of them. Created an environment that produced world-class footballers almost routinely, and for a time, Liverpool's academy was regarded as one of the finest in Europe. Here's the cautionary lesson that younger football fans need to hear, because it applies far beyond Steve Heighway's story. To produce greatness at that level, people stop seeing it as the result of years of careful work and start treating it as the minimum expectation. Owen, Gerrard, Fowler, Carragher, that becomes the baseline. And when the next group of players doesn't reach those heights, the academy goes through a quieter period. Suddenly, the man who built the whole thing is being questioned. Heighway admitted it himself. The early success became a professional burden. It created expectations that no academy in the world could consistently meet. Players like Steven Gerrard don't come along every 5 years. They come along once in a generation. But once you've produced one, people expect another and another. And when they don't arrive on schedule, the blame lands somewhere. Landed on Heighway. And that, his daughter has made clear, was one of the deepest wounds of his later career. Not a dramatic falling out, not a public scandal, just the slow, grinding experience of watching a lifetime of work being measured against an impossible standard that he himself had helped create. Now we get to something that Heighway was unusually direct about, which tells you how much it bothered him. He spoke publicly about a French manager at Liverpool who had, in his words, strange views and didn't like being disagreed with. Everyone in football understood who he was talking about. Gerard Houllier, Liverpool's manager from 1998 to 2004, had a very specific vision for how the club should be run, and that vision didn't always leave room for the kind of long-term, development-focused thinking that Heighway had built his entire career around. Conflict wasn't about personalities, at least not entirely. It was about two fundamentally different ideas of what football should be. Houllier needed results now. He needed players who could contribute to the first team immediately, or at least very soon. Heighway was thinking in 5-year cycles, nurturing players through their teenage years, building character and technique before worrying about first-team readiness. Those two philosophies were always going to clash, and when they did, Heighway found himself in a position that will feel familiar to anyone who has ever tried to do things the right way inside an organisation that's being pulled in a different direction. He had the track record, he had the results, he had Gerrard and Owen as living proof that his methods worked, but none of that gave him the protection he needed when the man at the top of the club wanted things done differently. The cautionary lesson here is one that goes beyond football. When the culture around you changes and the new people in charge don't share your values, your past achievements don't automatically protect you. In football, and in most industries, loyalty runs upward, not downward. Men at the top decide the direction. Men who built the foundations often find themselves working against the current. Heighway kept working. He kept believing in what he was doing, but the friction was real, and it wore him down in ways that only became fully visible much later. In 2007, Liverpool's youth team won the FA Youth Cup. It was a moment of genuine celebration, a trophy that validated everything Heighway had been building. You'd expect that kind of victory to be followed by a new contract, a renewed mandate, a public acknowledgement of what he'd contributed. Instead, Heighway retired almost immediately after the win. He was 60 years old, still sharp, still passionate about the work, and when he spoke about his reasons, he was careful but telling. He said he wasn't sure what the future held. He said the decision felt right at the time. Read between those lines for a moment. A man who had spent decades building Liverpool's academy, who had just won a major youth trophy, who had produced some of the greatest players in the club's modern history, walked away immediately after what should have been a crowning moment. That's not a retirement, that's an exit. His daughter has been more candid about what that period looked like from the inside. The restructuring of the youth setup under Rafael Benitez's regime had changed the landscape around Heighway in ways that made his position increasingly difficult. Internal politics had shifted, the support structures he'd relied on were being reorganised, and the environment that had allowed him to do his best work was no longer quite the same. He won the Youth Cup and then he left, and the club that he had served for the better part of 4 decades moved on without much fanfare. There was no grand send-off, no sustained public tribute, just a quiet exit after a career that deserved far more acknowledgement than it received. That is one of the harder truths his daughter has had to sit with. Here's where the story becomes something more personal than football politics or club hierarchies. The men who dedicate their lives to sport, especially at the level Heighway dedicated himself, don't leave the game cleanly, carry it with them. The habits, the identity, sense of purpose that came from being inside a football club every single day, those things don't disappear when the job ends. And when they're gone, the absence is enormous. Heighway had been a Liverpool man since 1970. Nearly 4 decades of his life were spent inside that club in one capacity or another. And then, in 2007, it was over. No gradual wind down, no transition period. Just the sudden stillness of a life that had been defined by constant motion and purpose. His daughter has spoken about how that transition affected him, the loss of routine, the loss of belonging, the loss of the daily environment that had given his life its structure for so long. For a man who had always been driven by purpose, who had always had a project, a group of young players to develop, standard to chase, the silence that followed his departure was genuinely difficult to adjust to. And the hardest part wasn't the silence itself, it was watching Liverpool carry on, season after season, without so much as a backward glance. The club didn't pause, it didn't grieve the loss of him, it just moved forward, the way institutions always do, leaving the man who poured 37 years into it, standing on the outside of something he'd helped build from the ground up. And then there's the physical reality of a life spent in professional sport. The body keeps the score, as they say. Heighway was a player who ran and ran, who threw himself into challenges, who played through the physical demands of top-level football across more than a decade. At 78, those years are felt in ways that don't show up in the record books. His daughter's revelations about his current life paint a picture of a man who is quieter now, slower, dealing with the accumulated weight of everything the game asked of him. Not broken, not bitter, but carrying something heavy, the way men of his generation often do, without making too much noise about it. And here we arrive at the hardest part of this story. Steve Heighway gave Liverpool Football Club the best years of his life, not just as a player, though his contribution on the pitch was real and lasting, but as the man who came back and quietly, methodically, built the production line that delivered Steven Gerrard, Michael Owen, Robbie Fowler and Jamie Carragher to the first team. Think about what Liverpool's modern history looks like without those players. Think about what the club's identity looks like without Gerrard, without Owen's goals, without Fowler's natural finishing. Heighway built the system that produced all of them, and yet his name is rarely the first one mentioned when people talk about Liverpool's greatness. That's the quiet tragedy at the heart of this story. And the cruelest part is that Heighway would never say it out loud. Men of his generation don't ask for recognition. They don't hold press conferences to talk about what they're owed. They go home, they sit with it, and they carry it quietly for the rest of their lives. His daughter, speaking now, is the closest this story will ever get to being told properly. He was an outsider who proved himself on the pitch, a player who faded from the first team before he was ready to go. He was a coach who built something extraordinary and then watched the expectations that came with it become a weapon used against him. He clashed with managers who didn't share his vision. He won a youth cup and walked away into near silence. Now, at 78, he lives with all of it. His daughter's willingness to speak about his life is an act of love, but it's also something of a reckoning. He's asking the question that football rarely asks about the men who give it everything. What did the game give back? For the younger fans watching this, the lesson is worth holding on to. Football is not a fair exchange. Men who build the foundations, who do the unglamorous work of developing young players year after year, hold the line between short-term pressure and long-term vision. Those men are often the first to be forgotten when the results don't come quickly enough. Loyalty in football flows in one direction, and it's rarely toward the people who deserve it most. Steve Heighway deserved more. He deserved more acknowledgement, more protection, more of a send-off than he got. And at 78, the life his daughter describes is the life of a man who gave everything and received something far less than everything in return. That's not a comfortable thought, but it's an honest one. Heighway's story isn't about bitterness. It's about what happens when a man pours his whole life into something that doesn't always pour back. From the dressing room mockery to the American collapse, from the Academy's impossible standards to the quiet exit in 2007, every chapter cost him something. Send some prayers for him in the comments below. If this story moved you, hit the like button and subscribe, because more stories like this are coming. Legends, real lives, and the truth behind the glory.